So hello, everybody. I lived in Japan for a long time, so being 3 minutes late, it makes me feel very anxious. So I think what we'll do is we'll get started, and I know we have people on Zoom as well, so we want to make sure we're respecting the schedule for them as well. And hopefully people will trickle in, and we'll see. I mean, we're just happy to be here. So I'm Marty Walters, and I came over from California today. I work in the area of commercial real estate, which is actually what all of us kind of are coming to you. We're sort of strangers in a strange land in a way, coming from the world of commercial real estate. Um, so I'll just briefly introduce everybody. To my left, Kate Flaherty is with TD Bank and is an environmental risk manager there. Charles Huyck is a executive vice president at ImageCat. And then Damian Wach at the end there is with Prudential and is an architect and is actually as we unfold here, you'll see Damian is the instigator for this entire thing that we're going to talk about today. So you can look at him when it comes time to think about who actually got this going.
Blame me if it goes wrong.
Yeah. So for those of us on the panel, for the people on Zoom, I think it helps for us to speak into the mic so that the folks on Zoom can hear us, even though I know folks in the room probably can hear us pretty well without the mics. So we'll use the mics just to make sure everybody can hear. So let's get started, and we'll advance. Are you going to advance the slide, or should I? Okay. So we'll prompt you. Thank you for helping us with slides.
If I could just check quickly, because I was told there wouldn't be anyone on Zoom, but let me just double check.
Okay. Oh, yes. I'm not sure how. Is there a Zoom audience option?
So there is a Zoom.
When you're the first panel of the day, you get to work out all the kinks, right?
Sorry, I thought you meant like a presenter as well.
Oh, okay. But is there a Zoom audience? Do you know?
I don't know.
I think I think all of these are open to
Okay.
Zoom as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. Okay.
Yeah. No.
So we'll pause there and let that get started.
All right. Great.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a little mini agenda here. We're going to talk a little bit about building resilience, and a lot of you guys know a ton about resilience, but we're going to be coming at it from this real estate perspective. And then when I talk about real estate, we're going to talk a lot about commercial real estate, but we're going to link it back to a lot of what happens for people in normal mortgages. And so just a little bit of terminology. When I talk about commercial real estate, I'm talking about multifamily homes, office buildings, industrial, all that stuff. And then we sometimes talk about consumer lending and consumer mortgages, which is for your single family home lending and all that stuff. We don't work in that area of consumer mortgages, but we'll link it back because that's the way we all think about lending and how we think about our houses. It's really important to tie those two things together. So we'll get started here. If we can go to the next slide. The first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about some examples. So you're going to hear what resilience, testing, building resilience in a warming world looks like from our point of view. So let's move on to the next slide. And one of the first ones we'll talk about is the Palisades fire earlier this year. And I actually worked on that fire. This is a snapshot from Watch Duty. I was a volunteer for Watch Duty and worked overnight on the Eaton fire. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Palisades fire. That was the same day. And there are two properties there. And Damian, I'm hoping you can talk to us first about the Getty Villa and some of the
Sure.
things that were going on. Let's get to the next
Sure.
slide.
Yes. By the way, what she says, do you know what Watch Duty is? It's an app. If anybody's from California, very, very popular now. And it was essential during the Palisades fire. And so she's being modest. She really was very, very important with Watch Duty. Anyways, yeah. So the Getty Museum, you've probably heard of the Getty Museum. There's actually different campuses in the LA area. All of them during the Palisades fire were threatened by fire. All of them did very well. We're focusing on the villas which was both an educational facility and museum. It's actually the oldest of the Getty buildings, over 50 years old. And as it turns out, unfortunately, right in the path of the Palisades fire, in a very, very high risk area. It was designed with wildfire resilience measures in place, and it was adapted even further over time. And those measures turned out in this case to be very, very successful, and that the villas really had no material damage. It was shut down for about 2 or 3 months after the fires, but really they removed over 1,000 damaged trees, foliage from the property, which shows you there was damage there, but just the trees. And now it's been open again. So just quickly, some of the features, although it appears to be sort of nestled in sort of a very bucolic, deep forested area, there's travertine plazas around the outside, acting as buffers from the woods to the buildings themselves. There's also a very, very robust irrigation system, not just water the plants so that they grow, but more importantly, they would sort of turbocharge irrigation that would turn on if there's an approaching fire, that would soak the what they call the canopy of the foliage around the property to prevent it from burning. Turned out to be very effective. Of course, using native plants as well, which is no surprise. Native foliage is typically more resilient to climate issues than imported plants. And then the buildings themselves, very little combustible material in the buildings, even the interior walls, concrete throughout. Of course, cost a lot of money, but in this case, it was worth it. Realize it's a museum, so they have a lot of priceless artifacts inside. Even smoke damage would be an issue, let alone fire damage. So they had very, very robust HVAC system, air pressure that was higher inside than outside. If you ever gone into a room in a building when you sense the door is there's pressure sort of closing or opening the door, that's because there's higher air pressure inside than outside. It's great for preventing smoke from getting inside a building. Anyway, a number of features that made this building resilient to the wildfires. Very successful example of how resilience does work.
And we don't know how much money they spent to do that. But if we
No.
go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about kind of back to the reality of our lives and what happens. So this is a multifamily building that was at the foot of the Palisades neighborhood. And it was one of the most affordable places to live in the Palisades at the time as a rental facility. So this meets my definition of a multifamily commercial property. And also built in 1972, so same year as that Getty Villa, and, had 75 units of affordable rentals. Here you had a building that still was in basically the same configuration as it was when it was built. So single pane windows, you see all this vegetation around the foundation, all that stuff was there, that could easily create little fires that then, um, create places for embers to get hold of and cause a fire within the building. So that was an example of a building that did not do well in this fire. It had never had any upgrades, never done any resilience work at all. And both of these buildings were located in very high hazards, wildfire zones. So let's go to the next slide and we'll just see. This is a structure damage assessment that we do after fires in California. And I've got the little markers there. So the houses that are the little house symbols that are in black are the ones that actually survived without damage, without fire damage. Many of them probably had smoke damage. And then the ones that are red are the ones that are destroyed. So you can see where the Getty Villa Museum is and also where our little apartment building is. And the interesting thing is, our apartment building was surrounded by buildings that did survive. And many of those buildings that survived were newer construction or had, some measures taken to make them a little bit more resilient. It's just a really good example of how wildfire doesn't always, destroy everything. This is a great kind of example of how it's very dependent on what the conditions were for that. Let's go to the next slide. And I think this one's also
Yeah.
Damian.
Yeah, so now switching to the East Coast, this is Florida and hurricane damage. Babcock Ranch, again, a success story. It was made the news in a sense. It was 2022 Hurricane Ian or Ian. At that time, I believe it's probably still the most expensive hurricane in the United States in terms of damage. This is only 30 miles from Fort Myer, this northeast. And it made the news because they experienced pretty much no damage at all, not even power interrupt, not even internet interruption. Again, success story. Even that tower you see in the picture was undamaged, and that's because it's what they call a perforated tower. In other words, it's if you look closely at the photograph, it's a wind can go right through that, right? It's got the image of a tower, but it's just what they call perforated. So, and a steel construction. Anyways,
Let's go to the next slide.
Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple things that the developers of this property did. The first, I think, and the most important is they located it, sort of a variation on a managed retreat in the sense of managed placement of the property. They built this property about 20 years ago, started the development about 30 miles inland and on a section of land that was about 30 feet above. As you know, Florida is quite level. 30 feet above ground, sort of above the typical floor level of Western Florida, which allowed them to do a couple other resiliency features. For example, like many of these, what I would call retirement villages in Florida, it's dotted with ponds, lakes throughout. Again, that's quite typical. But because of the elevation, they were able to engineer these lakes, sort of smart ponds, they called them, that they can, in this case, lower or even drain the ponds prior to a storm, to allow those ponds to collect and retain a greater volume of stormwater during the storm itself, as opposed to having it flood the streets and the homes themselves. Really extremely helpful resiliency measure. They also had additional measures in the streets themselves, a very strong stormwater management, a stormwater retention and drainage system. And then the buildings themselves, far above code, and we'll get back to this later on. Code requirements in the United States are, I think, slowly and gradually improving to make buildings more adapted to high risk, extreme weather conditions. But in most cases, you have to go a little bit beyond. And that's what the developers did here. They actually sought, there's different options. They choose the Green Building Coalition standards for construction of the buildings, which allows for design of Category 5 hurricanes. You can see the photograph on the bottom. These are sort of, one-story, low profile, very sort of simple roof structures with very little wind resistance, really well adapted to handle hurricanes. Underground power lines, which is fairly common for new construction. Another great feature, which in a sense they were fortunate to have, is a community solar grid system, which was very nearby. It wasn't owned by Babcock Village municipal, but they were able to tap into it. So they had solar energy and uninterrupted throughout the hurricane. Anyways, so a couple other measures as well, but this was another success story of carefully designed, resilient community was able to withstand a heavy hurricane.
Yeah, and speaking of infrastructure, that's also another thing that we finance in the commercial finance space is we're financing development of, both renewable and traditional kinds of infrastructure for energy. And those kinds of projects now are really starting to come under a lot more assessment in terms of thinking about how they're going to, be resilient going forward. And it's another thing that this standard that we put together is good for adapting for those kinds of all these weird different things, whether it's a landfill or a solar farm or a windmill or whatever it is, we can adapt what we're doing to kind of deal with those kinds of built environment. It's the built environment we're thinking about, right? um, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, so here, as opposed to Damian's example and Marty's examples, everybody here is probably familiar with Hurricane Sandy. We had a lot of New York City Housing Authority properties that were impacted by Sandy. And rather than having a proactive approach to resilience, Hurricane Sandy really showed New York was vulnerable to climate change, and we were having reactive reactions now. Now we're trying to close the barn door after the horses escaped a little bit. But some of the New York City Housing Authority properties received a lot of grants from both FEMA and the city to increase their resilience. This is an example of one of them, Astoria houses. And as you can see kind of on the lower left, is the plan to make the property more resilient. And one of the couple of things I want to draw your attention to is it's both impacting the buildings. We're trying to make the buildings more resilient, but we're also trying to impact the infrastructure of the site. There's boiler plants, there's emergency generators that were that are going to be moved and made more resilient. But more importantly, only impacted buildings received funding to get more resilient. As you can see on the east side of the property, none of those buildings are being addressed because the funds only addressed impacted buildings. And as you can see on the upper right-hand side, behind that construction fencing, you can see that concrete, that's that flood barrier that they built there. And if you go to the next slide. Baruch House is another housing authority property that was impacted by Sandy. But again, you see the plan is to make the property more resilient, both the buildings and the infrastructure. And including along that Baruch Drive through the middle, they're building a flood wall. But again, only impacted buildings that were impacted during Sandy are going to receive funding to become more resilient. It's not a property-wide correction, for lack of a better word here. And if you go to the next slide. This is that Baruch Drive, and down on the upper left you see before, and down on the lower right behind the construction fencing you can see the beginnings of that flood wall. Now this is from 2022. It might be further along by now. It's the only thing I could get off a street view. But this is an example of, instead of being proactive, we're reacting to these climate change events, and there's limitations in that. There's limitations to the funding. Obviously, people have already been impacted here, so we've already had damage. And the reason that I chose these two examples is a little bit later, we're going to really talk about real estate lending and the types of real estate lending and the kind of the decision points where we can add risk management value during a real estate transaction. And these types of properties are the exact type of properties that kind of go through that cycle. They go through it with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all kinds of government-sponsored entities that are doing lending. And this is the exact type of property that hopefully we can eventually get a property resilience assessment done during the lending cycle and maybe make some improvements in a proactive manner. Next slide.
All right, hello. All right, here's one more example of, I guess, how do you do things wrong? We've got, on the lower left, we've got the Hampshire Auditorium in Iowa City, by far the most expensive building in town, built right by the river. You can see right, somehow the arrows got messed up. I don't know how that happened. I apologize. So the structure is on top there, and you can see that the face of the structure is pointing right towards the river, and the edge of the building is about 10 feet from the Iowa River, which was protected by a dam, but when the water went over the spillway, there was an extreme amount of damage because it was by far the nicest building in town, the Performing Arts Center, and the damage was so extensive there and throughout the University of Iowa that it actually changed the way that the flood modelers coded occupancy information, because this high value university real estate needed to be separated from, trade schools and less expensive real estate for colleges. So this is on the right, the lower right, what they ended up doing to the facility. It'd be nice if that was pointing the river, but that wouldn't be responsible. You can see from the picture above that that's actually curved away from the river, a much wider berth there. And then there's a sort of a slope going up here, so that even if the water goes over the spillway, it won't flood. So this is just sort of an example of sort of what to do and what not to do when you're thinking about building some of these structures. And as Damian gets into some of the property resilience assessments that we'll do, we'll sort of show you how that decision making can be integrated into the process.
And I noticed they have a lot of parking closer to the river now.
Yes.
You can move the car. It's a
Parking
lot
can flood,
easier than
right.
you move the buildings, right? Let's go to the next slide. So we have,
there we
we
go.
had a little click there to show what the building looked like when it flooded.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next one. Yeah, so Damian,
Okay.
tell us about this property. See, I told you
Sure.
he was the instigator, so he's got to tell us what it's all about.
Well, so us four have had the privilege of working together the last several years on a standard, industry standard for how to evaluate or assess buildings, not just existing buildings, but even design buildings for resilience or adaptation, how to adapt a building to be more climate resilient. It's really important because we found it important because there's, as you can imagine, the last maybe 8 to 10 years has been a groundswell of technology and modeling science, climate science, trying to identify where globally there's going to be, more frequent and more intense storms of whatever kind, and how that's going to impact the built environment. There's a lot of climate models out there, and I know I work for Prudential Real Estate. My responsibility is physical risk management on a global scale. We have offices around the world, Asia Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States for South America. And I have been getting sort of requests from climate modeling companies for years. And how do I know what's one cost $100,000, one is free online? I mean, how do I know which one, how accurate is it, and what you do? What are the qualifications that I should look for the people that are doing this? So all those reasons, and Kate's organization has a similar, we need a standard, an industry standard. And so that's sort of the essence behind having this property resiliency assessment standard. It's sponsored by ASTM, which you may have heard the name.
How many of you guys know, have you ever heard of ASTM before? Some of you guys have. So it's this big industry standard setting, whether it's the quality of the caulking on your outside windows here, or whether it's something like this, or what happens to the environment. It's this set of incredible industry standards that we use.
Yes, yeah. How abrasive is the surface of that table? Yeah, but oddly enough, one of the areas where the ASTM standards are extremely important is in real estate assessment. If you heard the term of phase 1 environmental assessment, that's an ASTM term. There's an ASTM standard for that. So it's ubiquitous, a phase 1 in transactions in the United States. There's, for most lenders, you would never agree to loan money on a commercial building without a phase 1. Purchasers would never consider buying a commercial property without a phase 1. So there's a property condition assessments, there's a seismic assessment. Anyways, it's that organization that has now sponsored this property resiliency assessment as an add-on to those other features that the same investors in real estate, which are already engaging those other services, can engage this, in many cases by this, using the same firms. So that's the purpose behind it. Basically 3 stages, sort of intuitive. The first step or stage is identifying which climate hazards would impact that particular location. We've already talked about wildfire in California, hurricanes in Florida, about hail in Texas, tornadoes in Nebraska. It just depends on where you are. So the first step is identifying which hazards are a potential serious risk for a particular property. And then the second is looking at the specific characteristics of that property, the building, the design. How resilient is it to this particular hazard? Are there some adaptation features already in place? If not, then you get to the third stage, which is what needs to be done. What measures, adaptation measures, should be done or can be done to that property. So the intention is you go through this process, takes a couple of weeks, and then when you're done, you have a game plan, a pathway to make this property hardened or well adapted or more resilient to climate risk.
Thanks. Charlie, talk to us more. Let's go to the next slide. And
Yeah.
he's going to walk us through some of the sites, some of
Okay,
what we do.
so I'm just going to pace around because that's what I have to do. We're one of these fly-by-night companies that tries to do these. We've been
No, these guys are definitely not fly-by-night.
we've been doing this for several years before the standard sort of came about. We've sort of stumbled into it because of our interest in climate and our modeling space. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've been doing, some of the issues, because I think that might be interesting to this audience. So the first one is sort of looking at the site-specific hazard. And how many people do GIS work in this? Okay, yeah, I figure so. The first, as you can imagine, is looking at the location accuracy of where you've put that property, particularly if you've got a very sort of spatially intense focused hazard like coastal hazard, or where have you located that property compared to the hazard that you're comparing it with. And the base data accuracy can be very different there. You might, when you go in, you have I've got a picture of a building here on a very pixelated flood map. Where do you actually decide that you're going to be analyzing the flood hazard for that building, for example? And there's a lot of sort of uncertainty inherent in the data, especially macro level data that you have to sort of consider when you're giving somebody a report and doing sort of just the hazard screening even. Next slide. So stage 2 is scoring, and this is really the Wild West here. You can't really tell somebody that, they ask, well, how vulnerable, well, what's the hazard that might affect my structure? You say, oh, well, you have a wind speed of 125 miles per hour at a 750-year event, a 3-second peak gust. These kind of things, no one's going to be able to understand what you're talking about. You have to basically distill it down to sort of a low, medium, and high type of paradigm. And so we've all done this, right? All the gap modelers that are in this space have come up with their own sort of a way to say low, medium, or high in various gradations. It could be a scale of 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, 1 to 5, low, medium, high, that kind of thing. So, but there's a lot, that's the next stage of the hazard screening. There's a lot of things to consider that are pretty juicy when you start to drill down in there. So next slide. So first, does it include resilience and risk? So if you think back to that Hansher Auditorium, for example, the front doors face the river, nice and pretty, but that means that the water can go right into the structure. Do you consider the assessment of the resilience, the first floor elevation, the vulnerability of the actual contents? Do you consider these things when you do the scoring or not? Is a lot of people just say, okay, that's high because it's got this hazard value. That's issue number one. On the climate assumptions, are they explicit? So probably most of you are familiar with IPCC and the different SSPs, climate scenarios and so forth. If you're trying to give a score, low, medium, high, based on climate, what have you used to project climate at sort of what decadal mark, and are you doing it for now? What is now? Does it include changes that have been incorporated into the climate that have not necessarily been incorporated into the hazard map? All these questions are really important when you start to assign the score. Okay, have you normalized by hazard? This one's a little abstract, but if I explain it, you'll see the importance of it. So if you think about tornadoes, for example, your probability of getting hit by a tornado, even in Tornado Alley, is really slim, right? So if you think about the probability that you'll have complete damage of your structure, it's going to be very low compared to anywhere in the southeast for hurricane damage, for example. So do you make the worst hurricane score 10, or do you make the worst hurricane, sorry, do you make the worst tornado score 10, or do you make it like 3, right? Do you make it so that you can compare amongst hazards when you're making your decisions? So otherwise, you know, I got a 10 on tornado and a 5 on hurricane. I should put all my effort into mitigating for hurricane. Well, that would be the wrong decision, right? Because the probability is so low. So coming up with scores that integrate that sort of subtlety is difficult. Are the breaks meaningful? Can you really tell somebody what red means? Is key. Be able to explain that in simple language, and also sort of what return interval. What we've started to do through these standards organizations actually is come up with a 100-year flood that people evaluate, 475-year earthquake that people evaluate, and a 700-year wind speed that people evaluate through. So that's different. That's another apples to oranges situations. If you start to give people those answers back, they're determined to those different return intervals. That can be quite confusing.
So Charlie, that's why all of these reports, when you guys look up your house on Zillow or Redfin and you start getting those scores, it can be really hard to figure out what they actually mean, right? Have you ever looked at those and gone, huh, that's weird. That's not really the way I see my house because of all these elements that go into it.
You talk about the climate scores?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah, so even at the first level, there's a lot of really, and you know, the commercial real estate market is sophisticated. They're trying to make extremely, you know, costly decisions, and so they'll ask the probing questions to try to figure out, you know, how they're making these decisions. So that's where you know, online for a free report, not so important, but if you're trying to, you know, build this building, for example.
well, that's one of the big differences with our standard too, is that you need to disclose some of the assumptions that you're using, and there needs to be transparency. You know, whereas a lot of these, I don't want to call them fly by night, but these data companies that are pushing out reports, it is definitely a little more black box, and you just have a hard time really understanding what the assumptions are that are going into it. Let's move
All right,
on.
let's move on. Okay, so then finally, you have to sort of integrate vulnerability, we call these damage functions, uncertainty, and get to the risk of the actual property. The way we do this is sometimes giving people a horizon for coastal properties, for example. How likely are you to have, it's a little false precision here, but how likely are you to have your home flooded given a lower emission sea level rise scenario or a higher emission sea level rise scenario? Or what are your losses likely to be at a given return period given different climate scenarios? So our clients tend to be more engineering based, so they'll want that additional information. But regardless of how you give that information back to the client, you need to be able to give them something based on risk so they can make that decision. So that's stage 2. And then next slide. Oh, sorry, I've got another one on stage 2. So a lot of that is also going in and looking at the vulnerability. So this is just a sample with a flood map, going in and seeing, well, what's actually going to be flooded. Talking to the engineers who have been on site. Street view helps a lot. Do you have underground parking? Do you have expensive amenities on that first floor that are subject to flooding, and so on?
And that's why the stage 2 is so important, because it really requires you to look at the specific property, you know, and none of these data models are going to get down to that level of granularity. We have to be able to look at that specific property.
Okay, next slide. All right, so one of the areas that I've been sort of focused on with regards to the committee is really talking a lot about community resilience considerations. And this, I think, was the most controversial topic, don't you think, Damian, that we addressed? Yeah, a lot of talk about this. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, I was just going to say, Charlie and I we were talking a lot about this during our calls when we were having this, but The thing about community resilience and the reason why it's so important and so controversial is because traditionally when we're making financial decisions about whether to invest or whether to lend on a piece of property, we're looking at the boundaries of that property. We're not really spending a lot of time looking at community resilience, um, or even features of the community other than the valuation, right? Like, is it, how does it compare to other properties within the community? This is new. This is kind of a new area for us, and that's why we're having to tackle it pretty in a creative way.
So this is an area where we've done a lot of research at ImageCat. So just framing the problem a little bit, this is literally a poster child structure here in it's in Louisiana, but it was affected by Hurricane Katrina. They built tuck under parking on the first level with a little bit higher than a standard first floor, and the storm surge just went right through the building. They opened up. They could have opened up the next day, right? Yay. Problem is, this was the neighborhood for 10 years. So how are they going to? Who's going to want to come to the beach, right? How are they going to sell those condos or rent those hotel units? It's just not going to happen. So, our commercial real estate clients are really interested in trying to figure out how to make the best bets in order to, at the community level, for their real estate investment decisions. So this Appendix 11 was sort of talking about that. Next slide. And so there's all sorts of questions that we can ask the asset buyer or key facility developer in terms of what their priorities are at a single location. Or we can ask the investor at the investor level to come up with a strategy for where they want to invest in the United States. So we come up with this a series of metrics for them to answer that we then build into a modeling system. Why don't you give us the next slide? And so here's an example of looking at downtime. Some folks, downtime is more important to their business than the actual physical damage. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, and we've at Prudential, we've had experiences. We've had properties in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, for example, and the repair cost to fix the damage was less than what we call the business interruption cost. In other words, the cost to the property of existing, say, if it's an apartment complex without tenants or 18 months while they repaired, that lost income is greater than the repair cost, sometimes significantly greater. And
So, Damian, how do lenders like you typically manage that kind of risk for that business interruption? What's the traditional way?
Insurance is sort of the age-old solution. I think not a great solution. We can talk about that later on because it's sort of reactive, not proactive. But nevertheless, if you know anything about property insurance, if you ever own a property, you have insurance. There's what they call business interruption coverage, which means the insurance claim will pay you for the lost income for a period of time. On a commercial level, it's typically sort of 12 months, 18 months, whatever. And then so as the insured, you can make a claim, hey, I don't have any tenants in my apartment building, and you get paid back for that. So it's a very important part of insurance, and that's how it's addressed.
Yeah, super important. And I'll tell you one thing too, those insurance proceeds, they go to the banks that have the mortgage on these properties.
Yeah.
And that's how the banks make sure that they get paid back, on these mortgages during these downtimes.
Yeah, if you own a home, and you're paying a mortgage, chances are the mortgage holder, the lender, is paying your property insurance. They're escrowing money every month from your mortgage to pay your property insurance because they are terribly afraid of your property not having insurance. That's sort of a worst case scenario. They want that insurance and they want to make sure it's done, so they'll pay it themselves out of your pocket. But yeah.
So getting back to some of the analysis that we do, this is by no means typical, but if you have that situation where the downtime could be extreme, in this case, the client was talking about $1 million a day, business interruption insurance. You can take the likelihood of disruption, considering the entire community, bridges going out, power going out, other transportation impeded, the workforce being impeded, assign a probability to that and run a Monte Carlo situation where you get the likelihood and the duration of every sort of eventuality. Of course, there's uncertainty about this, and we present that as well in other graphics, but basically by level of hurricane hitting in this case. So you can do very, very sophisticated analysis. And commercial, unfortunately, this type of stuff is only is expensive, and it tends to be a niche, but the asset quality can, the asset value can drive some extremely high quality risk assessments.
Ooh, and that's a good example of how commercial real estate's really different from the consumer side, right? We are not required to have business continuity insurance. And as a result, we don't tend to analyze our downtime risks. But on the commercial side, because the numbers are so much higher, that's where you see this big difference between commercial and consumer.
And also, in terms of resilience, how quickly can you get this building back up and running is really important.
All right, next slide. Okay, so for other clients, what we've done is come up with metrics of community resilience, looking at things that could disrupt the local economy, and then come up with metrics of those, analyze them at the MSA level, and used it to help people prioritize where they would want to invest for climate change, right? And this is essentially drives managed retreat. If responsible developers are looking at possible community impacts and putting their dollars where they're less likely to have those impacts, that's a very slow in the background version of managed retreat. So I've got some here's some of the some of the maps that we came up for different metrics: wind, wildfire, flood, and water security. If you drill down on each one of these, there's sort of a series of detailed metrics that we have. Next slide, please. So here's the one for water security. What is the category? What is the metric looking at diversity of the water supply, capital improvement programs, how responsible the government is, and so on. You can come up with a scale, and 1 to 5, just basically by reading through their literature and coming up with one of those models. And next slide. Oh, and then from that, you're able to come up with a score that allows them to decide whether they want to invest in that community. So what I did was I went through an example for Iowa City. This was not one that the client was looking at, but since that's where I'm from and had a lot of data, this was a validation exercise that we went through that I can now share with you. So the university had 2 500-year floods in the period of like 25 years. And they did bounce back, but it's a good example of how we can use these different metrics to analyze the community resilience. So the first one that we look at is industrial and supply chain disruption. So next slide. Next, maybe. All right, next. I thought I was going to be the driver here. So if you look at these red, oh, this got messed up too. No. If you look at the red arrows, some of them are pointed at the industrial assets. This is where you get your toothpaste and your toothbrushes from in the lower right. This is looks like there's quite a bit of flood exposure to those areas. If we analyze that and every other MSA in the country, and that got a 4 out of 5, that means that sort of 80% rank of hazard for that metric. Next slide. The commercial business district exposure. Next slide. So that's the center of downtown. Next slide. Yeah, maybe I should just, here we go. Oop. I guess it was a little sticky. So yeah, the downtown area was right there in that flood district. If you analyze that and compare it to all of its peers, another one at the 80%. Historic disaster declarations, that was a 5 out of 5 with those 2 500-year floods. So let's just go ahead and go. And southeastern hurricane exposure, that's a none. Residential exposure. In this case, all the residences are built away from the river, which is not unusual, but that actually ended up being only a 2 out of 5. These are just getting messed up. I apologize. And then the last one, shifting flood hazards. If you go to the climate change, IPCC, and you look at, can you go just one back? The animation just must have been having problems. Yeah. If you go to the IPCC and look at the likelihood of increased rain in that area, it's not that drastic. And if you look at the flood zones themselves, it's very channelized. So those are two factors that lead to a less greater climate resilience with regard to flood hazard for a community. So in this case, it was in the median, 3 out of 5. So you add all those up. Next slide, please. You get 18, and compared to all of the other MSAs, so it should be one forward, that was essentially 4 out of 5. So 18 was a high 4 on a scale of, for the whole country, they range between 3 and 27, essentially a 4 out of 5. So this is just an example of how you can come up with these sort of metrics and grades and use it in a very sort of a mixture between a quantitative and a qualitative way to be able to prioritize investment in different communities, but also sort of understand the probability of having those sort of community-wide disruptions away from the single site that you're interested in. Okay.
So yeah, just to kind of drive home the community resilience aspect using a local example, you guys might be familiar with this East Side Coastal Resiliency Project that's happening downtown. It really kind of what I want to drive home here is the amount of stakeholders that community resilience impacts. It's not just residents. Here, this project alone is 110,000 New Yorkers total, 28,000 residents in this area alone, but it's 3 different parks, it's utility upgrades, it's water mains, it's electrical substations. All of these things are a boon to the people that live in this community. So it kind of to drive home what Marty was talking about and Charlie was talking about the controversy in having this standard address community resilience. The bank is trying to fit this standard, or a lender is trying to fit this standard into their general due diligence, which is done on a site-specific basis. We're doing an appraisal of a property. We're doing a phase 1 of a property. We're doing a property condition assessment of a property. When we're doing a PRA of a property, clearly the community resilience matters significantly, right? If the utilities are resilient, that's better for this investment that I'm making there. But the bank does not control the community. The bank, it's very hard to take into account the resilience of the community on a site-specific basis, although it clearly matters because, as we've said, if this bridge is down, the business interruption loss is significant. So that's kind of why it was such a challenge to build this community resilience aspect into the PRA. Where did we land with, it was kind of, it needs to be considered as part of what we're doing, but I think maybe in the future, hopefully, fingers crossed, we get a community resilience aspect in there. But this is just a really good example of the amount of money it takes, first of all, to address community resilience, but the amount of stakeholders that it really does impact. It's truly a game changer when, as opposed to just making a site resilient.
Let's move to the next slide.
Yeah, so now we're stage 3. Stage 3, remember, is sort of coming up with a game plan to fix it. In other words, if we've identified hazards and vulnerabilities at a property, now what can be done? And typically, I've found when we engage PRAs, there's a list, maybe a dozen different measures that can be taken to make the property more resilient. It would probably be ineffective to do all, well, expensive, but all 12 of them. You select the ones that are most efficient in terms of cost versus return. But on a big picture, what can, say, a stakeholder do? In this case, an investor do once they've done an assessment for a property for resilience. Of course, you can avoid it. You can say, well, this is, bad news. This property is very susceptible to wildfires. Let's say it's, garden style apartments in California. Lots of flammable, combustible, wood siding and cedar shingles. No, we're not going to touch this. In a way, that's sort of a type of managed retreat in that the property may have a difficult time getting financing, getting insurance, unless they themselves make it more resilient. So you can try to divest that's the musical chairs thinking. In other words, this property is at risk. And when the music stops, i.e. when there's the next major climate event, who's going to be stuck, paying for it? But I mean, I think most responsible investors would want to mitigate, right, to a certain degree. Of course, I would favor resilience measures, for flooding, for example, backup power, moving equipment above the flood level, aqua dams, helipads was Charlie's idea.
Real world example.
Yes. Yes. Anyway, so these are, this is the goal. The goal is to make the built environment more resilient to climate risk. And so this is what you would do.
And in a commercial real estate context, one of the things I do is I teach our bankers how to do this kind of work. And I always talk about the traditional environmental risk hierarchy, that those of us who studied environmental, I remember it as AMRO: avoid, mitigate, remediate, and offset, right? In that order. And we do try to do that. But I think when it comes to trying to make this work in an imperfect world, you end up using a lot of these different mechanisms together often to try to mitigate. And so you might end up doing some mitigation on the physical building, but you might also rely on a lot more insurance if you can get the insurance. So there's these different strategies that we have to use in that case. So let's move on, and we're going to move on. And in the interest of time, I think we've got 35 minutes left. I want to try to make this a little more interactive as we go into this next session, because this is kind of the fun stuff where you guys get to challenge us on our decisions that we make. So how do we actually get to this next stage? Let's go to the next slide. And there's a couple of options. So Damian, you're going to talk to us first about this kind of the slow option, and tell us more about that.
Yeah. So building codes, for example, I mean, every building in the United States is built to a code, right, at the time it was built. And most of us think that's great. In fact, unfortunately, you hear stories about earthquakes, for example, in third world countries, and you can see from the photographs, they have no reinforced material in the walls. The codes clearly were lacking, and people suffer from that. Anyways, in the U.S., building codes are fairly, they make our buildings safe, but they don't. I could classify this as slow and steady progress. Codes are still developing. In fact, there was a FEMA study recently, this is noted at the bottom there. Only 65% of the current codes are local. Every city or county has their own building codes. They often adopt an outside standard, but only 65% of the codes are current to the latest technology of buildings in the United States, particularly with respect to climate resilience. Codes generally are maybe 5 to 10 years behind. And if I mentioned earlier with Babcock Village, if you really want to design a building that's resilient, you have to go beyond the building code. New construction, replacing aged buildings, a great idea. New buildings are definitely more resilient by code. Older buildings are not. I have to acknowledge, we should acknowledge that in terms of carbon emissions and the greater issue of global warming, new construction is not a fan of responsible development. It's far better to retrofit existing buildings than to tear it down and build a new one. The amount of carbon emissions during new construction is significantly much higher than in what I would call recycling older buildings. So it's a playoff. Resiliency would favor new buildings. Carbon emissions would favor, decarbonization would favor renovations of existing buildings. Just moving on down, there are some government financing programs. Local ordinances, I find LA has a local ordinance requiring seismic upgrades to buildings built before, I think, 1965, which is great. There are some local ordinances trying to address climate risk, but I find that it's obviously very political. It's often unpopular. It's very difficult for a local city council, for example, to successfully pass an ordinance requiring upgrades to buildings.
Do you guys, anybody here know, have you been aware of any ordinances in your world that have been, I want to hear.
Oh, I live in Houston, and after Hurricane Harvey, we elevated the standard, but it's unpopular.
Yeah.
Because it increases costs and potentially reduces tax base.
It is tough. Anybody else here have?
So I live in Vancouver, despite the accent. So yes, changes for earthquake readiness, some are required in commercial buildings and so on, but absolutely no evidence for doing anything that reduces carbon. It's the home of Greenpeace.
Oh, so interesting. So Vancouver has a seismic ordinance,
Yes.
but nothing relating to resilience.
Credits and
Yeah.
seismic, but nothing on carbon.
And I think in the US context, these retrofit ordinances for building resilience, I could probably count on maybe one hand, maybe a hand and a finger. But, California passed in 2020 a law to require existing buildings to be more resilient to wildfire in high wildfire zones. And they have not been able to get that implemented yet. And they are, in fact, after the fires in LA in January, Gavin Newsom passed an executive order saying, hey, we got to move on this law. We've passed the law. We don't actually have the ordinance. We don't have the actual standards yet. So they've set a goal by the end of this year to have standards, but it's going to be incredibly hard and incredibly unpopular to actually implement. It's going to be tough. So slow, but maybe steady.
Yes.
Let's go to the next, why don't we go to the next slide? Yeah, so the faster.
That's right. So you can follow where we're going with this, our logic. So a faster way to do things is harnessing real estate transactions, buying and selling and refinancing property, homes, commercial properties. What if we could tie in resilience into that process? So that's the idea. So it's amazing how many, 4 million homes are bought and sold every month in the United States. That's an astounding statistic. So what if each one of those 4 million homes what if the lenders, before they would give a loan, would say, they already do this for flood, by the way. If you ever, again, bought a house, EPA requires commercial lenders, homeowner lenders, to get a flood certificate to make sure the property is not in a flood hazard area, which is great. What if they extended that to any climate hazard as a first step? Anyways, and then commercial real estate, as I mentioned earlier, already assesses floods and earthquakes through ASTM standards in the United States. So the idea is, what if we could harness commercial real estate transactions as sort of the impetus for starting assessment of buildings for climate resilience?
Yeah, that's great. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about real estate lending, and I'm going to be a little bit of the challenging person in the room too, because one of the things I know, Damian, your investments are high quality, really responsible investing. I don't know if you guys know, but Prudential does a lot of affordable housing lending, really cool work that gets done. And then, Kate comes from similar role where, banks, so, we have a real estate investor regulated, banks regulated, they tend to service a wider range of kinds of customers. So they might include, investment grade type investors, as well as like smaller investors. And I think there's a wider range of what the decision making that happens. And so that gets back to this kind of idea of equity and fairness in the system and what happens, why do some kinds of loans get more attention and more, more planning, more risk management than other types. Spoiler alert, it's all about money. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so you've heard of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you know, they control 75% of all this chart is for private homes. 75% of all the homes in the United States, 75% are financed by one of those two agencies, sort of government-sponsored entities, GSEs. And then another, actually 10%, almost all of it is by private securitization. PGIM, we do this quite a bit. Ski Bank, you know, many lenders do this. Fannie and Freddie and HUD, well, they control the market. So they are what I would call the policy leaders. If whatever policy they have, the entire commercial real estate industry follows. Not even for multifamily. It extends to commercial as, you know, apartment, retail, you know, shopping centers, whatnot.
So here's a question, you guys. Remember the global financial collapse? When was that? More than 10 years ago now. You know, one of the things that we heard a lot about were collateralized mortgage-backed securities. And I know you guys are thinking to yourselves, whoa, I see mortgage-backed securities here. Like, what is going on here, right? Like, why do we have this huge market still? And it goes back to this whole US policy. This is a US thing that you're not going to necessarily see in other countries, that, you know, the whole idea is that lenders will originate loans and then sell those loans to a government sponsored entity. And then the government sponsored entity parcels them together and then sells it out as a security. So it's no longer a mortgage, it's an investment product. And that's that whole transformation that happens in the markets, in the capital markets. And so the thing to keep in mind here is that once that happens, it's out of the banks, right? The banks, they only have the opportunity to really look at and to underwrite at the time that originating that loan, right at the beginning. And then it goes into this markets, and you know, there's property managers that do stuff, but you're not going to be able to do a lot of risk management work once it's been securitized. You don't touch it. You know, we don't touch it. Once it's been securitized, the whole idea of that system is to free up capital so that banks will then go and lend to other people, right? That's the whole concept. That's why the US financial system developed this whole scheme of doing this kind of securitization work. And it's something that I'll tell you, I come from the environmental engineering side, so I didn't know anything about this. And I'm one of those people that I had to have the light bulb turned on to say, oh, okay, now I get it. So it's similar. We're showing you here the single family home market, but it's similar in the commercial space where you have a proportion of loans that are originated and then sold and securitized into the capital markets, and it becomes securities. And then you have a portion that stays, we call it on balance sheet lending, that stays with the bank or with the lender, that stays on their balance sheet, and then they're managing that. So that's maybe where there's more opportunity for, you know, more proactive risk management through the whole life of that loan, compared to when you are just originating the loan and then sending it off to the capital markets. So you have to really think about, where are your opportunities, right? Where are you going to be able to make a difference in the quality of that asset and how well it's going to stand up to all these natural hazards that are getting worse and worse.
So yeah, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have they're the gatekeepers for multifamily real estate, but they have policies. In fact, more than that, they have socially responsible policies. HUD at the bottom of that chart and FHA also have government agencies very, very, I would say, rigorous socially responsible requirements. So every time a Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, I'm looking out the window at these large multifamily apartment complexes, chances are they're Freddie or Fannie loans, or maybe a HUD loan. But in either case, they've already had this list. They've already had ADA assessments reviews, handicap access reviews, Fair Housing Act assessments. They've had flood risks done. I know it, because Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac would never allow a loan to close without these. Earthquake protection, not in New York. Asbestos, lead paint, I am confident these buildings have had asbestos surveys, lead paint surveys. asbestos operations and maintenance plans. These are all designed to protect the safety and health and well-being of the occupants of the building. That other stakeholder group, which government entities are very concerned about. You can argue that a for-profit private landlord may not be concerned about the safety and health of the tenants. So be it. That's probably in many cases true, but they can't get by Fannie and Freddie and HUD if they want to finance. So that's the gatekeeper, and they establish the policies. Sometimes it's not perfect. There's ways to sort of try to work around a radon test. For example, this is what I deal with every day, is making sure people don't avoid their responsibilities on these transactions. But the point is, radon testing is done. Thousands of units are tested every day. These are all existing policies that have been implemented over the last 20 years or so. And all of them, without exception, use an ASTM standard to get it done. Fannie and Freddie HUD require these standards for assessments. Anyways.
So Kate, talk to us a little bit about what happens. You've done a lot of securitized loans. You've done a lot of non-securitized loans. You know, the kinds of banks that Kate works for are the ones that are really servicing the whole spectrum of it. Talk to us about what happens with some of the loans that don't qualify. You know, the properties are not really up on this scale.
Well, so I think probably a lot of people don't realize that the rate at that time where we're talking about due diligence, whether it's appraisal or property condition or phase one or hopefully PRA, the bank has, you know, there's a little bit of a carrot and a stick. The bank has the money and you want the money, and it's not happy with some level of risk that you have at the property, right? And if it's not a Freddie or a Fannie loan, that doesn't mean that the bank already still doesn't have its own risk tolerance and its own kind of risk appetite, for lack of a better word. So a lot of these items already, even if they weren't Fannie or Freddie loans, are going to be addressed in some way by the bank. Certainly most multifamily properties, if they're in a high radon zone, regardless of Fannie or Freddie, bank is going to want some level of radon management to make sure. Bank is very concerned. Lenders are extremely concerned about their reputation. So they're extremely concerned about occupants of the property. And a lot of people might not realize this, but kind of going back to that traditional environmental risk standpoint, a lot of remediation in the country is driven by somebody wanting money, right? People don't go out and sample their gas station to find out if they had a release out of the goodness of their own heart, right? Somebody is financing that gas station, and the bank wants to make sure that they're not on the hook for $1 million cleanup, right? Or a shopping center with a dry cleaner. The bank is pushing that requirement down to a property owner. So all of these things, whether, you know, if they're not managing their risk appropriately or they're not in one of these programs, the bank is generally going to catch that risk in its due diligence, and they're going to push down a requirement or push down some level of holdback or get some level of insurance, something to mitigate that risk. So even if you're not managing the risk currently, if you're in front of a lender, 9 times out of 10, they're going to catch it and they're going to make you mitigate it some way before they close.
Yeah. And the thing that's interesting is, so when it comes to property resilience, like, it's not our first rodeo. You know, all of us came into the banking and commercial real estate industry from doing remediation work and representing the money on the side of these remediation projects to get these projects going, whether it's development or an existing building that needs to be cleaned up. And so the nice thing is we've got infrastructure within our commercial lending groups that can adapt and do a lot of this work. So it's new. I mean, it's definitely new, and it's not been applied a lot yet, but we have already a lot of infrastructure for that. And it's an infrastructure that involves the people within the bank, like Kate and myself, who do the analysis and figure out how to make it work for the loans. But then it also includes people like Charlie or Elena over here, who are consultants that work for the banks and do all of these assessments and do the science behind it all.
And I think what it should mention is, kind of, Damian was talking about mortgage-backed securities, and these are really sophisticated investors. In a lot of cases, they're not waiting for the bank to tell them what the risk is. They already know what they're trying to manage it for themselves. Certainly from a CMBS perspective, they don't need the bank to tell them. They're trying to manage it themselves.
That's right.
Let's go to our next slide. I've forgotten what the slides are, so it's all
No, these are just some examples. So as
good.
what Kate and Marty have just been saying, yeah, several of us put together, we did some investigation about a year ago. Over the last 20 years, commercial real estate transactions, what they've done based on the phase ones and the property condition assessment, 200,000 environmental hazard investigations. Kate's absolutely right. I mean, there's been most of the time, if you hear about, if you see a drill rig drilling around the property, trying to find a potential release from a gas station, it's not the landlord who doing it. He's not doing it just because he's concerned about his tenant's health. He's required to do that. There's an investor saying, hey, if you want our money, you've got to do this test. That's just the way it is. So 200,000 investigating 60,000 cleanup projects at multifamily properties alone in the last 20 years. 600,000 apartments have been protected from asbestos, either remediation or some similar project. 200,000 indoor air quality protectors. 130,000 apartments protected from radon gas by the installation of radon mitigation systems in those buildings. Again, none of that done by the landlord on their own. Maybe some, but that's not in this. This is a record from the phase one reports commissioned by the lenders. So very successful, in my opinion, work.
And I think it's just a really interesting perspective on, what's actually happening in the world as a whole that sometimes is not very evident on the surface, right? On the surface, you interact with a landlord or you interact with a property owner, but behind that is this whole system. And we saw, that there's just constant churn in the real estate market where these properties are being bought and sold, and every single time there's a bank involved and there's there's an investor involved, and then there are consulting firms that are doing all these analyses, and it's all there behind the surface. And I think it's a tool that we all need to be just more aware of. And, sometimes you got to put pressure as well on the system to make those tools work better. Let's go on to our next slide. I think we have a couple of examples.
I just want to state the obvious perhaps, but these upgrades to make properties more safe for the occupants, in most cases, they do nothing to make the owner generate more income or reduce their expenses. There's no real gain for the owner other than being a responsible ownership. And so this is the trigger for climate risk. We have to acknowledge that adapting buildings for climate risk in most cases isn't directly going to benefit the owner of the property. They're spending money. They may think this is a waste of my money. I've never had a fire at this property, and now I'm being told I'm at risk of wildfire. I have to spend $100,000. So this is what's going to motivate that.
Talk to us about Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, so this is just another example and kind of to drive home the points we've been making here. Clearly on the left side, you see a lot of the impacts from Hurricane Sandy here in New York. And on the right side, you've got the investor's point of view, right? They've got a climate event, and now they're worried about future climate events. And now the worry about future climate events, should I invest here? It's a little bit of a snowball situation, but kind of, again, reinforcing that point that it might seem like cynicism that people aren't going to do stuff unless there's money involved, but that's actually an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to use the money to drive the positive, right? Especially from a community resilience perspective, you improve the community resilience for the area or for the city. You increase investment opportunities because the investors are not going to have cold feet about the area. They're not going to have cold feet about the business interruption. So the interests are aligned, even though it might seem like a cynical transaction. It really is an opportunity to increase investment in an area when you increase the resiliency, not just of a site, but of a community. So that's kind of the point of this slide. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good reminder. And we call it this talk. We talked about asset quality, right? And asset quality being a driver. So we've kind of given you why, and it's a reminder to us that when it comes to these assets and how we live in them and how we work in them and exist in them, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And from the banking perspective, we have a lot of experience managing all these different kinds of conditions, and and we're totally confident we can expand to deal with a lot more resilience work. But it does also rely a lot on regulation of financial institutions and our financial regulatory agencies leading the way and having Fannie and Freddie setting that standard, right? So there is this really delicate balance that happens, and it's one of the reasons why financial regulations are so important to this kind of scheme, because that's what reinforces the good behavior and the good risk management and I mean, we've been through some financial booms and busts. Like, we know we need to reinforce. We always have to reinforce that from a regulatory perspective. Let's go to the next slide. So next one, please. Yeah, so where we are today, so we just published the standard in November of 2024. We were trying to remember when we started working on it, and I think it was 2022. So it took us a long time. The ASTM is a collaborative process. So it's a collaborative consensus-based standard. One of the things that makes it great is once you have a consensus-based standard, there's actually a mechanism for the US government to adopt that as a guidance. So they can adopt our ASTM standards as a guidance for things. So that opens up that door. It's actually what happened with our phase 1 environmental site assessment. That's actually a government guidance for reducing your liabilities under the Superfund law, which we don't need to talk about. But I think that, that we really have to acknowledge that because of the pressure on the federal government right now and the huge impacts of the rollbacks and the funding rollbacks from the Trump administration, we are dealing with some pretty significant problems trying to get this going, because we don't have that government-sponsored entities. The Fannie and Freddies are not integrating this directly into their standards yet. And so we're trying to, make that work from a risk management perspective from within the banks, but we don't have that explicit financial regulatory backup that really is important to the process. So that's going to be really, interesting to see what happens. But of course, reality doesn't stop whether, it doesn't stop for Trump, much less anybody else. So we are seeing more impacts. Insurance isn't working the same way that we have. The real estate industry has externalized. They've outsourced a lot of risks to the insurance agent, the insurance business. And when it's not working anymore, we have to start relooking at it. So that's a reality that banks have to look at, right? And so we just need to be thinking about that. And then I'll return back to my point about lower value assets. There are a lot of like small apartment buildings, small multifamily buildings, small business properties, commercial properties that don't really get a lot of this attention that we've been talking about. These are small assets with small values. A lot of times the community banks are often financing those kinds of things. So they are adopting a lot lower standard for that, what they do with those types of properties. So just keep in mind, like, we're definitely showing you a way forward, but there are a lot of small value commercial properties that do not get that same attention. Any other, I want to make sure we're getting short on time. So questions about any of that as we go along? Go ahead.
I guess, hi, thank you for your time today. Sarah Rosner, the Director of Responsible Investing Research Alliance for Steve. And I guess I have some questions around how this is actually manifesting in loan pricing and the decisions you're seeing from developers or investors in terms of, I'm just not going to touch this. What is that looking like? How is it trending? Be great to get your take. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to take that on? Damian's got his mic up.
Touchy subject right now. But let's say at Prudential, we do have a evaluation metric for our credit decisions that does, it, 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 we do include rating or scoring for climate. Yeah.
And remember, when we talk about making decisions as lenders, you know, we often talk about credit quality and asset. The actual quality of the asset's only one of the five, you know, the 5 C's of credit. If you can look that up later, but asset quality is only one. You know, it permeates a lot of other things too, but it is one of the criteria. There's a lot of other things that go into it. So we contribute to that overall decision-making process, but we are not ever the decision makers in the end. You know, we're just contributing to what happens in that credit decision-making. We had another question back here, and then we'll come back down here.
Hi, thank you so much. This is great. I have a question about data, and I know Chuck, you talked a lot about that as well. But even when Franny and Fetty were in the position to make these kinds of decisions, my understanding is that they were hesitant to do this because of all the variation in data sets and data quality. How confident do you feel about the data that you use in your decision making to sort of compel some of these changes?
You want to go ahead, Charlie?
Yeah. Not very. You know, I mean, particularly if you look at Helene, they hit North Carolina, it's the projection of future flooding due to wet, hot storms. It's just not, there's nowhere in the scientific literature that you can quantify. A lot of, there's stuff that's released every day, but a lot of what we do is have to be very, very nimble, try to integrate the best science. And there's a lot of stuff where it's just like, maybe bump it up a notch. I don't know. I mean, and we're not alone there. So it's, there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
I'd say, speaking just real quickly as a lender, one of my main challenges is I'm an expert at the phase 1, right? I can read a phase 1 and tell you if it's done correctly, if it's done wrong. I can understand all the science, right? I get a PRA or I get one of Charlie's reports in. My level of knowledge is, you've seen how dense a lot of this stuff is, and it really is a learning curve for a lot of the professionals, and each hazard has its own professional, right? So it's just a lot of science. So I would say it is a good question. We're not there yet, but everybody's thinking about it. I will say that.
That's great. Yeah. Damian, did you want to say anything?
No, it's an excellent question. I mean, this is, I deal with this every day. It's my responsibility at PGIM to tell our investment committee that the data I'm giving them about risk is accurate. And so it's very difficult. Flood risk, for example, in the United States, there's the FEMA flood maps, which in my opinion are not reliable. They're generally historically based and not forward-looking. And then there's other Moody's, Munich Re, there's other flood maps. I think the key is, I'd hate to keep pushing the PRA, but the PRA has qualification requirements for those assessors that do the work, like Charlie. So I find if we can engage the proper qualified experts and let them tell us which data is the most reliable, that's what we do.
And there is kind of this filtering process that happens in reality, which is you might be working with a whole bunch of properties and a whole bunch of loans. All of us, you know, you're looking at a whole bunch of them. There's a filtering process where you're going to be filtering down to look for what are the issues that are going to drive a decision. And so you're not going to put a ton of effort into the stuff that's not going to drive a decision, but you are going to put a lot more effort into what's going to drive that decision. And I think that's a really important part of what we do, and we just need to get better. We need to get better at it. And you know, I did my first phase 1 environmental site assessment in 1988. Okay, and then we developed the standard in 1993, I think it was. And then the US government adopted it in like around 96, 97. It takes a while, you know, for these industry things to develop. And I think it's just, that's the nature of it. Lucy, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, my name is Lucy Cummings, and I'm the Director of Faith Sector Resilience at New York Disaster Interfaith Services. So I want to start up by thanking you all, because we put together a climate resilience audit program for houses of worship around New York City. And it's an inspection, a walkthrough inspection program that's also a workforce development program and we couldn't find any resilience metrics. And so we're using the ASTM metrics. They're accessible. It's a big deal. So thank you so much. And then 2 questions. One is, when will energy auditors get up to speed? When will, this is my crystal ball question, when will in New York, NYSERDA, Department of, like, it's just nowhere on
We
any
need
of
to
this.
pull that together because the thing is, all of the energy resilient, like energy efficiency stuff plays into resilience. You know, with wildfire, I'm a wildfire
Absolutely.
mitigation. I'm actually certified now. I can do an I can do an ASTM. But with wildfire, you know, having the double pane tempered glass windows, that you know, that resilience measure for wildfire and for wind also makes your building more efficient, right? Doing on-site and there's just so many interplays between efficiency and resilience that we need to actually integrate that together. But that's the cool thing about with commercial real estate, is that we are starting to gain that expertise within the industry to do these integrated types of assessments.
So one last quick question. Are there examples of tax incentives or regulatory infrastructures that are looking at not only the resilience risk of tenants or users, but how do you lessen the impact of these developments on surrounding communities? We hear that a lot in our work, and I'm wondering how we're incentivizing real estate development to really think about what they're doing to local communities.
I don't have a good example, but that's an excellent question. And in fact, we have examples where making one property more resilient actually has a detrimental effect on their neighbors, particularly with flooding. I don't have any answer to that.
Well, and the whole local government, you know, the local hazard mitigation programs and all of these things, we traditionally have not interfaced a lot with local planning for resilience from the commercial real estate side. And I think it's something we need to do more of. And I'll tell you, for me personally, I live in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and right in the epicenter of where the Dixie Fire happened a few years ago that burned almost a million acres, this largest California wildfire. And I didn't have a clue. I had not a clue. I've been living there for 20 years. And so as a result of that kind of personal experience, it got me going to really reach out to understand what was happening. So I stood up our local, our long-term recovery committee, and I started really integrated, you know, talking more to my county about what was going on. And that's just not something that we have a lot of ties together. And I think we need to understand that better, because you're right, the interplay between resilience, you know, what happens within the community, it's just so different than what we think about traditionally in commercial real estate, where we're so hyper focused on a particular property. And we need to move away from that and start thinking more from a community side.
Can I comment on your first question about carbon emissions? So ASHRAE is I think within a week or two is going to publish a whole life cycle assessment, method of calculating carbon emissions for buildings in their entire life cycle carbon emissions, which means, you know, from initial design all the way through demolition. ASHRAE.
Yeah, that's really, yeah. And California has a law too about building materials. So they're really pushing the frontier when it comes to carbon.
Right. So realize when you're
materials.
doing construction, you know, a true evaluation of carbon emissions includes the emissions of all the materials, even if you're getting, you know, the furniture from the Philippines. You know, what sort of carbon footprint does that desk have? Anyways, but resilience does play into that, because if you design and build a building that is not resilient to the increased frequency and intensity of storms, for example, in that area, and then every 10 years, you have to renovate the building because it's been damaged, the life cycle carbon emissions of that building will be higher, maybe much higher than if you designed or even adapted the building initially to be resilient.
I know we're at time, but I'm Sarah Labowitz. I'm at Carnegie, and I maintain a disaster dollar database of the FEMA and the HUD money. And it's like, $55 billion worth of FEMA, 50 of HUD. And one of the things that when I was at the city of Houston after Hurricane Harvey, we were trying to do was stretch the federal dollars with a kind of philanthropic and capital stack that would have allowed us to do more with the federal money. We were not successful. And I'm wondering if anybody is thinking about how do you stretch the big federal money that comes after disaster to increase the capacity to develop?
That there's so much that we can learn from brownfields, for example. When you talk about a capital stack, that's all the different parties that are putting money into getting a project done. And we've learned like to redevelop contaminated properties requires, sometimes you're combining grant money, tax credit money, all of these ways to create the stack of money that actually gets that project done. And that's what we need to start doing. We don't currently, that is not on our horizon. And I think we need to start moving toward understanding, because, if you ask us about the way that capital works for dealing with some of these more traditional challenges, we can take so much from that and apply it. The sources of funds are just places that we haven't traditionally worked with. Anybody else have any comment on that? Any other questions before I know we're running a little late. I have no idea what the schedule is. Do we get a lunch break? Do we not get a lunch break? We got a lunch break.
Yeah.
We could take another.
That's all right. So I work with the state of Hawaii, Land and Natural Resources, and oftentimes what the real estate industry considers to be resilient actually has a negative impact on our public trust resources. So I'm happy that we're in the same room.
Oh, aloha, Bretta. I was born and raised in Hawaii, so ex-local haole.
You mentioned tying resilience into real estate transactions, and that idea intrigued me. Is that something we can do on a state level, or does that require federal action? And if it's state, how do I do it? Easy one, eh?
No, that's a really good question. And I think, again, how how you actually construct, like the decisions to lend are all kind of at the private level, right? It's private capital, but the programs are often publicly funded for certain kinds of things. And I think if you can work on the areas where the state is investing in housing, multifamily housing particularly, is such a great way to start influencing that, right? Where you can link multifamily housing where using your dollars and your investment money to put those strings on there, everybody in that capital stack is going to have to pay attention to that requirement. And so that's, again, anytime there's a requirement, whether it's New York City has our local law 97 here that has to do with energy efficiency. All of us we know all about that. As soon as there's a local ordinance or a state ordinance that affects that, the capital stack and how you're putting your money in and how you're making those decisions, we pay attention and we start integrating that into our decision making.
There has to be cost offsets too, though. I mean, I totally agree. I'm an affordable housing developer from Chico, California. Nice. Chico. And absolutely we have to build resiliency into both retrofits and new construction, but just adding costs mean that we're not going to be able to build housing that is affordable for people. And so what are those offsets that we can find? So strings, sure, but our state is really good at adding strings without carrots.
That is a really tough question, especially in a place like Chico. And I live just up the hill in Quincy, where we don't have rich people that can afford, we're not in this big urban environment. We have a lot of places in the country that need that kind of affordable element. And I think that that's going to be a really concerted effort to do that. And it's hard because all of these programs cost money, right? We're dealing with accessibility, wheelchair ramps, all of that stuff adds cost, and environmental protection often adds cost. That has to be absorbed somewhere. I don't know.
There's possibly a way to make sure it's not linear as well, like this whole transaction thing. I think it needs to be the municipal level again, what's happening in a city or an area can be very different to the state. But using one example back from Australia, which is the cities, it's still inland area, lower property values and so on, have the same assessments by municipality for a lot of environmental building standards, whereas the people buying on the beach where the house is normally 5 or 6 million, we're paying a far higher amount. So at the risk of, penalising the rich, but hey, let's face it, cross-subsidisation can work and it can help to build a fund while protecting the lower income and still trying to achieve an outcome. So yeah, transactions, I think municipal and cross-subsidisation are ways to look at it.
I will also put in a pitch for the banks. There's this Community Reinvestment Act that requires banks to invest back in the community. It's all through real estate. In order for a bank to achieve, to get approved for merger or acquisition, they have to pass their CRA exam. And those CRA exams often, will have recommendations for, like, they have to be able to show that they're investing in low, moderate income communities at a certain level. So every commercial bank, big commercial bank, and down to the community banks will have a program for community reinvestment, and put pressure on them, like engage with them, talk to them. The more they talk with, whether it's a private developer that they might fund or whether it's a city program, the more you can get the banks involved in that, the better it is. There are banking advocacy groups right now that are advocating for banks to go into community benefits agreements where they're actually voluntarily going above and beyond to invest in low, moderate income communities and to do things like resilience. Like, that's not in the regulations, but for example, not too long ago, US Bank bought a bank in California and they agreed to go above and beyond to do more climate related reinvesting into the community as part of that program. So there are programs out there that need that attention from the public, right? They're kind of flying under the radar. And so pay attention and ask. I mean, I'm happy to talk about CRA any day.
C-PACE investment. Have you heard of C-PACE? I don't know
Yeah,
what commercial, it's different states have authorized C-PACE investing. I know we ran out of time, but a property can get a loan, C-PACE loan, but it has to be either for decarbonization or resilience. And then it's paid off through tax. It's just added to their tax every year. So it's a relatively inexpensive loan for that purpose.
All right, we have our emails up here. So if you're hungry, you can just email us in case you want to get a hold of us, or through the Huma app, of course.
Yeah, we better let people eat here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And we're here if you guys want to talk more.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, I'm so glad you came.